Welcome to the Connor's Corner segment of Ask the Lawyer. You know, many times on the show we talk about the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, World War II. One period of conflict in American history that kind of gets overlooked or forgotten is the War of 1812. To try to correct that situation, we have Colonel Joseph Davidson, current commander of Fort Hamilton. He's going to tell us a little bit about the War of 1812. How you doing today, Colonel?
I'm good, Mike. Thanks.
Okay.
It's a great honor again to be back here. So thank you for having me back. I didn't know if last time, I was undersold or oversold, but I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about, as you said, probably the most forgotten war in the U.S. history, and that is the War of 1812. Some will call it the extension of the American Revolution, or Part 2, if you want to call it that. It's an interesting war because it is fought by some of the same people. All right, so you had some revolutionary veterans, and it really had two phases. Well, it had a lot of phases, but two distinct phases where the first half were the U.S. forces are losing badly, and then the second half we're winning, and actually. If you look at it from a strategic standpoint, they don't make any sense why we're losing in the beginning and we're winning in the second part because of who we're fighting, right? So, because we're fighting the second team for the British in the first part, because they're engaged with this little guy, literally stature little of Napoleon in France. They defeat him, and so their A team, their varsity, is off. In France and parts of Germany fighting Napoleon, and then they ship their A team over to North America to fight the Americans. So, and then we turn the tides. So it doesn't actually make sense. So when we're losing, like I said, when we should have been winning, and we win when we should be losing. Now there's a bunch of reasons for that. So let's talk about why did we have the war in the first place. So it starts because of enslavement. The Navy. The British Navy, it starts a policy of enslaving U.S. vessels and at sea, and they decide anyone who has ever been a British subject will always be a British subject, and therefore, as U.S. Carriers are going by, ships, they say, they come on board, they imprison, enslave all of the U.S. sailors and put them in the Royal Navy. So that starts really in 18. I mean, that was going on as early as really 1808, and it kind of heightened up. And as President Madison comes into office, he makes it a policy to stop this. So he takes a formal drafts a letter to the king, essentially, and to the British Parliament saying this will not be tolerated any longer. Stop, and they don't. So hence we start actually the War of 1812 against the British to stop this. Now at the same time, there was a lot of talk about Canada, right? So we got this northern neighbor. We tried to annex it, if historians will remember, in the American Revolution, and that failed. And actually, Benedict Arnold, it was one of the first things he did, and it didn't go well. So we decided let's go up into Canada. So there's actually initially in the war there's two districts that are fighting, and that's the Ohio River Valley. Out in Ohio, and then up in Canada. And so the United States military, is very, very small, and it's small by design. By the Constitution, says we will only maintain a small, active, standing army. Notice I said army, not the Navy's not subject to the same. That's because they were fearful. The founding fathers were fearful of a coup. Right? So armies overthrow government. So if you only have a small standing army, there's less of a chance that there would be a coup. So what we have is the system that most people learn about in elementary school of the Minutemen, right? That we had in the American Revolution. It's a militia force. So the states are authorized to have militias. And so that's who's going to fight as we go. We declare war on Great Britain, and we're going up. So you have militias that some are good, some are bad. There's no standardized training. There's no standards for military units. And in a lot of cases, the militia leadership are elected officials or appointed or are the wealthy people who can afford, because they're going to provide a lot of the uniforms and munitions in some cases for their regiments. That doesn't go very well, right? So that's who we're fighting against. Like I said earlier, it's really the B team who's in North America for the British, but we have horrible results in the northern New York theater of operation. We have pretty good results in the Ohio River Valley, mostly due to Native Americans. So the leaders out it's Henry Dearborn and future President William Harrison out in the Ohio River Valley are smart about who they're using, and the Indians help get a bunch of victories out there. So that's going well. Northern New York, not very well. We have a few forays into Canada, all dismal. So we go into fighting seasons, right? So the winter comes in 1813, and so we're going to go into camp and refit, go into training cycles. And so we're learning some of our own lessons, which is good. So really that's the advent of what I would call the standing professional army in the United States. And a lot has been written about this period, right? So now you have a young, he was actually a captain of artillery and becomes a brigade commander in the spring of 1813, training up in the Buffalo area and getting the militia actually to standards, right? So and that's of course I drop a name in a second here.
Winfield Scott.
That is, thank you, Winfield Scott. So that's Winfield Scott as a young person who's self-trained, right? So another one everybody's reading really at the time Prussian manuals and some French manuals on arms. So he formulates a training plan, gets uniformed, gets everybody in a standard uniform, and prepares them for the next fighting season. Simultaneously, the British are now also doing riverine operations down in the Chesapeake. So they're moved down into the Virginia and Maryland area and are highly successful. They do raids. They're going up along the Chesapeake, burning towns, and obviously famously eventually work their way to Washington, D.C. and burn the White House, which incidentally...
And that seems almost inconceivable. The White House could be that undefended and unprotected, and a raiding party could burn it.
Yeah, it is to modern day, yes. Back then, probably was inconceivable as well. But when you don't apply defense, there was no strategy to defend the city. In fact, each city had its own defense because, again, the militia said so. So Baltimore had a defensive plan. Philadelphia did, as well did New York. But those are really the only defensive plans that the government, the U.S. Military had. The rest were kind of adapting or countering to what the British were going to do. So we were not prepared for these riverine operations whatsoever. So they were highly successful. There were a few decent stands by the Maryland militia in just outside of Baltimore. Obviously, they have the famous bombardment onto Fort McHenry, which is captured in our Star Spangled Banner. But mostly, the British had the upper hand. So, as I said earlier, come April of 1813, the British Army defeats Napoleon and Leipzig. So that's really the final battle of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, and they start sending their experienced, in arguably the best army in the world at that point, or at least in Europe, who's just defeated Napoleon, to North America. And so they're going to be up in Canada, and then ultimately that part of that same force is going to be later in that year, down in New Orleans. So that's their A team, and we, like I said, have been losing to their B team, but we've learned, and we've become fairly proficient at getting rid of what I would call the crony system, right? So the political appointees and the just because you have money doesn't make you a military commander. So we got rid of that system, and we started really a meritocracy. So that's Winfield Scott's kind of at the lead of. Like I said, he was he's 26 years old at this point. He's a young man, given great responsibility, and so we are training to a higher standard, and we are now having an active force. They become active duty units. So Congress appropriates more infantry regiments. So in the two first years of the War of 1812, we went from a 6,000 man army, to over 26,000. So we add a significant amount to include artillery, right? So we were lacking cavalry and artillery especially, and infantry. So we start adding all of these, and they're employed for, correctly. Now we have varying, so we roll into the fighting season of 1814. We have varying results in Canada. Right? So Winfield Scott leading. We have some victories, Bloody Lane, and when we lose at Queenstown. We're about 50-50 there. We're about 500. But our forces are getting more professional. Some of those forces will move further upstate along the St. Lawrence Riverway up to Plattsburgh, right? So which will play a pivotal role in the final stages of the War of 1812. And then simultaneously, some of our southern militia under another future president, right, Andrew Jackson, is moving out of Tennessee, and they've been fighting, actually not the British, they've been fighting the Creed Indians, right? So they've learned a lot of valuable lessons from Texas and Louisiana and Tennessee fighting Indians, and they're formulating for the British next push. So the British decide in their last season they're going to do a two-prong attack from out of Canada, from Quebec down through. Essentially, they're trying to do the same plan they attempted in the American Revolution, essentially down the Hudson, if you will, Hudson River, to New York City, and kind of cut the country off to New England and seize New York City. And then,
was their plan to take New York City?
Well, it was to try to cut the country off and find pockets of who is a loyalist still, right? Who wants to, in their mind, New England would join back in with England. And then simultaneously they were going up to New Orleans. Now, New Orleans itself is not any strategic goal. The Mississippi River is. So they want to control the Mississippi. So again, splitting, and that's a big commerce thing, and so it's that's what their goal is. So they do two near simultaneously. They're off by a few months, but pretty for 18th century warfare, that's pretty close in succession. Their forces, which is a naval battle, actually up in the Great Lakes, up and around Plattsburgh. We're again a very, very, very young Navy, and we were very fortunate in having some young naval officers who not only did we rush and build a bunch of frigates just in time for this battle, but we had some naval officers who were really daring and held the British at bay, which is, again, that's the probably undisputed best Navy in the world at the time, the British, the Royal Navy. So
We need to take a short break. We'll be right back in a few minutes talking about the War of 1812 with Colonel Joseph Davidson. Welcome back to Connor's Corner. We're talking to Colonel Joseph Davidson, military commander of Fort Hamilton, and we've been discussing the War of 1812. We broke off when we were talking about the Battle of Plattsburgh.
So we were talking about the last campaign season of the War of 1812. So this is it's now spring, summer 1814, and Battle of Plattsburgh. So it's really a naval battle, but there is a army fight on the shores in Plattsburgh, New York. Again, some of it, quite honestly, is dumb luck on the American side. We had people in the right position, which is good, that they had positioned themselves. Some of it had to do with British did not seize some opportunities, and we prevailed. So we were very fortunate. Now, a lot of it had to do with the training that had been instituted earlier that year in professionalizing both our Army and our Navy, too, at the same. We had learned a lot of lessons learned from the first 2 years of fighting, which didn't go well. So we're a lot more seasoned and a lot more professional. So that helped stem the tide there, and so we prevailed in Plattsburgh. And then in the southern part of the country, you have Andrew Jackson, who has rallied a bunch of militia units. And I mean, it's an interesting group. You look at the Battle of New Orleans and who he has on our side, because he is, I mean, in modern day, I think we would call half of them pirates and mercenaries. But he's a person with a lot of charisma and leadership, just natural leadership ability, and he rallies all these varying groups and comes up with a very good defensive plan. Actually, a very unorthodox defensive plan, but it's what we would call now a defense in depth. And he has, so locals who, local Louisianans who understand some of the swamp areas right outside the city. And they are the first line of defense, and they do a very good job of harassing the British forces as they come forward. And the British are not used to that, right? So they're used to 18th century warfare, where they're going to come line up on a field and square off, force on force. They don't get that chance initially, and so they're under their own, and it's a kind of a quasi riverine operation, and a lot of obstacles that were made. So we treated them, and then by the time they got to what was the battle proper in New Orleans, Andrew Jackson has a very good defensive system of earthworks all set up. With a very proficient militia, like I said, really primarily from 3 different states who engaged the enemy. Unlike a lot of our militias, unfortunately, earlier on in the war, did not break ranks, held, and also a lot of them were crack shots, and the British actually didn't even hardly stood a chance. So I don't want to say it was a rout, but it was pretty close to a rout as far as the defense goes. The British quickly licked their wounds and got back on their ships and sailed off. The irony is everyone talks about the Treaty of Ghent was signed, ending the war actually back in December, a month prior. So in theory that battle should never have taken place, but it did, and it also showed the American resolve. So two things, that the biggest lessons that came out of the War of 1812 really was professionalism and having a standing army and a standing navy, a larger force, and it also really legitimized the United States of America in Europe, especially. Because now we just taken on, if you want to put it in boxing terms, we just took on the heavyweight champion and we beat him. We had beat him before, but we had assistance of France and in the American Revolution. This time we did it on our own. We did have some financial backing from a few different places in Europe, but really it was our own forces, and like I said, we solidified our own standing military, and we've grown from that. Right? So a lot of things that were done there, we've incorporated. I mean, some are simple. The uniforms that Winfield Scott, put his what was called First Brigade in the spring of 1813 in training are captured, and that's what the uniforms that the cadets at West Point continue to wear, that gray uniform. People always, so there's some unique historical ties, but a lot of them are just learning from our own mistakes and being willing to admit that we've made mistakes and to learn from them. And also it was the beginning of the military by Congress, by the Constitution, going back to Congress and asking for additional appropriations to build and justifying, and that goes on every year. So all that stuff really started then, and as we've grown as a country, has continued on. So some of the traditions were born then. So it's an interesting time period. A lot of interesting characters obviously come to light. As I said, two future presidents are leaders in the War of 1812, which is a commonplace, really, actually through World War II, right? So we will have continual military leaders who will eventually become future presidents. So that's it's an interesting war.
Now, some historians, their take on the War of 1812 was really kind of like a draw. We didn't really win by we, the United States.
Yeah, we didn't. So we didn't take any. You're exactly right. So one of our, I think you could say it's a draw, right? So we stopped the.
I'm not saying it.
No, you can argue. You can argue it either way. I think it's a win. I count it as a win because it puts us on footing to become really, aware of our own strength and our own, understanding the country and what an important role we will play in the world. So that's why I think it starts. But yeah, we didn't annex Canada. Right, that was one of our initial goals. That didn't happen. So yeah, that's part of it. That's kind of in the lose column. But overall, I think if you're defeating the top navy and the top army in Europe, I'd give it a win, and luckily, short of Pearl Harbor, no one's tried to really, and Pearl Harbor is a isolated attack on a military installation, really, but no one's really tried to. We haven't fought a battle in our country since. So that's other than with ourselves, right? So you got the Civil War, but that's American on American. But we don't have a foreign entity trying to take on. We do all the fighting, so we haven't really played a home game, if you want to call it that. We're always away, which is good. That's the role of the military. Today I get around and talk to a lot of people, and we're your away team, and that's good. We have a lot of law enforcement. They're the home team. FBI and a whole bunch of other federal and state and local agencies who do that, and we go away to help protect U.S. interests, right? So, and hopefully keep the peace that way.
All right. Well, thank you, Colonel. Thank you for your service to the country. You always have to say that. And thank you for bringing history to light. And I hope to see you again before you transfer out.
Thanks, Mike. It's my pleasure. It's always a great honor to be here, and thanks for the offer. So.